I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. First discussion item is Zoning Board of Appeals training. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jill.
Great, thank you. Nice to see everybody here. Well, most of you. So we have the opportunity as the Zoning Board of Appeals sort of gets back going again. We don't have that many appeals on a regular basis. So it's nice to have an opportunity to do some training from time to time. So we like to do it, if not every year, maybe every other year. So it seemed like a good time to do that. So while it gets loaded up on Susie's end, just for the benefit of anybody who might be watching, to let them know that the Zoning Board of Appeals is staffed, if you will, by the City Council. And so that is something that some communities do. Some have their own separate membership for the ZBA, but in this case, as in some other communities, the City Council serves as Zoning Board of Appeals as well. Oh, there we go. All right, so we don't have a terribly long training presentation, but where we want to get started is just sort of an overview, talk about the establishment and the structure of the Zoning Board of Appeals, talk a little bit about your roles and responsibilities, a little bit about meetings and how you run them, and what we call etiquette, which is sort of like the finer points of running a meeting and how to interact with each other and with staff and applicants. So getting started, I'm jumping up to slide 4, I think. There we go. So we start sort of with the statutory authority. So how do we in the city of Lathrup Village come to have a zoning board of appeals? And this is included in Michigan Zoning Enabling Act. That's PA 110 of 2006. It says the zoning ordinance shall establish a zoning board of appeals. And then there's a few different standards that kind of go along with that. In communities, they have a minimum of 3 or 5 members, depending on population. Most communities have a 5 to 7 member zoning board of appeals. On the next slide, there's a little bit of a difference. And again, this sort of points to the ability of the city of Lathrup Village to have city council serve as the ZBA that's permitted in cities and villages. And then a special provision for counties and townships that 1 member must be from what is called the zoning commission, which in most communities is the planning commission. And so serving in that liaison capacity. The remaining members are selected and they are typically members of the community. If you go to the next slide, typically the terms of appointment are 3 years and they're staggered so that we don't have any expiring, the whole group expiring at once. We don't necessarily worry about this case because it is the city council. Some communities do pay a per diem or per meeting fee for the service. It's usually very minor. No one's going to get rich or have a second career as a zoning board of appeals member. If we go to the next slide, we have also a requirement that the zoning board of appeals should adopt the rules of procedure. Which I believe we have that. So going into roles and responsibilities. So in general, the zoning board of appeals is a quasi-judicial body. It is an important part of due process for applicants and municipalities, and all decisions or actions, requests of the Zoning Board of Appeals are public hearings, and they are noticed as such. So generally speaking, if we go to the next slide, they are important for planning and zoning purposes. They can essentially make or break the community's planning and zoning efforts. They can affect, the decisions can affect the character of an area or entire city. And again, the ongoing training is really useful. As a general rule, and I'm going to say it up front, even though I've gone through these training in other communities, and at the end, usually if people are paying attention, they'll say, so if I'm understanding this correctly, we really shouldn't be granting any variances. And I say, yes, that you have been listening and that's true. So not to say that you shouldn't grant any, but they really are intended to be that relief for really unique situations. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. So if we go to the next slide, we look at responsibilities. So all actions of the Zoning Board of Appeals are application driven. That means that a property owner is going to seek relief from a particular requirement of the zoning ordinance. They also could be coming to the Zoning Board of Appeals for an interpretation. So some clarification on what A map means you might see a case where there was split zoning on a parcel, how that might affect the property, or interpretations of the zoning ordinance itself. Once a determination is made on some wording in a zoning ordinance, if an applicant disagrees with that, they can, or if there's any clarity in confusion about it, that either that applicant could come see you, or even administratively, we could ask the ZBA to make an interpretation sort of ahead of that. With respect to appeals, they're related to a decision. They could be related to a decision of the administrative official or the body, like the zoning administrator, the building official, the planning commission, or legislative body. They could be related to the special land use or PUD only when they're permitted by the zoning ordinance, which isn't the case here. They can be also for a temporary use approval, but we don't have that in here as well. Appeals to decisions regarding the zoning ordinance issues are the responsibility of the ZBA, and those appeals have to be based on the record. So, for example, if someone is denied a building permit because they don't meet a certain standard, and the applicant disagrees with that, they can present their case to the Zoning Board of Appeals and say that there was something about the way in which the standards were applied in this case that were incorrect. So if this isn't, and we would convey this to an applicant, it's not that we're shopping for answers. We don't get a no from one authority and then seek another to get a contrary opinion. We're really looking at what was the information that was presented and did they miss something. So we don't we really only are addressing just what's being asked in that case. So when we're looking at administrative appeals, really, we're just looking at, was the decision being appealed made properly? And if it is, then we uphold it by denying the appeal. And no, then the ZBA reviews the case based on the standards of the review. And those should be outlined in our zoning ordinance as well, and make a decision on that. We're not finding new information. We're really only looking at the information that was presented originally as well. And I might just stop at that point if anybody has any questions about the administrative appeals portion of that. Do you want to add anything? I'll just also let you chime in from time to time. If you feel the need. Okay, I'll continue then. Okay, so next potential appeal or request before you could be an ordinance and a map interpretation. So with ordinance interpretations, we would try to look to previous interpretations. May not be the exact same item, but it could be something similar. Maybe we're looking at the same section. Maybe we're looking at something that's related. To see how determination was made in the past, maybe looking at the facts of that appeal and what was happening around that. Really trying to be as narrow as we can. We're not making things up here. We're not putting into the interpretation something that doesn't exist in the ordinance language. Really, and then looking to make sure that our interpretation is practical and we have the ability to enforce it. If it's a map situation, the ZBA cannot move the zoning district boundary line, but it could, there may be something about that map that may be unclear. And so we may be asked to do some interpretation. I haven't seen many of those. No, what was that?
I was just asking you, I think you started to answer my question. I was going to ask if you had an example of that.
No, not really. It I think would probably tend to be more of the case if we had a map that didn't base it on parcel lines. So there may be some confusion about where the line is, or maybe if a parcel had some split zoning where the district actually falls within that property, that might be something that's asked of you, but I don't think we have any cases like that here. And then there may be administrative appeals. Again, it's really just about an error in the order, the requirement, the permit, or the decision or refusal. We kind of covered that already. I think I'll skip over the special land use and the PUD appeals because those are not appealable here to the ZBA. So on dimensional variances, these will be the most common requests that the Zoning Board of Appeals will see. All the decisions shall be based on and put on the record. So findings of fact will have included. Where it can be tricky sometimes is when the ZBA members are putting themselves in the shoes of either city council or the planning commission. But your task is very different, and you're very much focused just on the standards of the zoning ordinance itself. So looking at whether I've got some of the slides mixed up a little bit here. Let's skip to the next one. Skip to the next one there. Looking at the situation in the case itself. So is the problem self-created? Do we have unique circumstances that exist with this property? Would strict compliance with the ordinance prevent the owner from using his or her property for a permitted use? Will a lesser variance than requested give a substantial relief to the owner and be consistent with what's happening on adjacent properties? And will the spirit of the ordinance be observed and public safety secured and substantial justice to be done? That's quite a mouthful. And what we're really saying is we're looking at what is the case before us? How did the applicant come to meeting this variance? What are they asking for? And then looking at, is there some other way that this project that they're looking at could be done in a way that more closely conforms to the zoning ordinance, if not matches the zoning ordinance? Is there something unusual about their property that prevents them from complying with the standards of the ordinance? In some cases, we don't really have much of this here, but there could be an unusual topography. We don't really have that much here, an irregularly shaped lot. Now you may see some of those come up from time to time that make some of those setbacks challenging. Is the request consistent with the character of the area? Would the variance confer a special privilege? So are we asking, would a property owner be asking for something that otherwise other people would not really be able to do? Looking at the minimum amount necessary, that can be a really tough thing to ask for people as they're coming to the appeal. Because it may involve asking if they, for example, if it's an addition, have you thought about making a smaller addition on your house? But it's a reasonable question because the standards are what the standards are. And the ordinance says what it says, and the setbacks are what they are. And it is expected that that's what the city intends for those areas. And so ensuring that there are no say requests made just because that's what they want. That's where we have to say, well, we're sorry. Sometimes it can be a tough thing to say no, but sometimes we have to do that if it doesn't really meet the setbacks or the ordinance requirements. Again, or there are other alternatives that would minimize or eliminate the need for a variance. So the same questions of the applicant. And we do try to work with applicants up front to go through some of those things. Have you considered putting this in the backyard? Have you considered minimizing the setback? So trying to help them, or at least say, or when they come to us and say, well, we tried that, but it didn't work. And we say, well, make sure that you convey that to the zoning board of appeals so that they understand some of the iterations that you went through before you came to this point. So in the zoning ordinance, we have the establishment of the criteria for granting the variance, and really the ZBA's analysis should just be looking at those criteria. Again, only the minimum variance that's needed to provide the substantial justice should be granted. And in general, that means granting few variances. If though we see that there's a consistent demand for a certain kind of variance with respect to a certain kind of setback, and whether the ZBA grants them or not, that might be an opportunity for the city to take a look at that standard and say, you know, we've gotten a lot of this and we've had this in the past. I would say probably maybe 3 years ago, we did some work looking at the height of accessory structures, I think it was, because we'd had a lot of requests. I think the old height was like 8 feet or something, and we increased it to 10 because we'd had a lot of requests of the zoning board of appeals. And the zoning board of appeals, your hands were tied because it was difficult for people to say, you know, we have a hardship because we can't build a garage or an accessory structure. But then again, you know, looking at those requests, it seemed that ZBA shared that with the planning commission and asked the planning commission to take a look at that. So we'll get into a couple of examples of dimensional variances on the next slide. I'm just using the R1 district here. Go to the next slide with the zoomed in look. So we're going to assume here that the lot is conforming. So we're going to assume that that's the case. And that there's no natural features to avoid. So we don't have any trees or topography or anything that's unusual of the lot. The red line shows the 5-foot setback line, and it shows a new house that's only 2 feet from the side lot line. And so if we go to, so in this case, we would be asking, you know, it looks like you've got plenty of room here on the site. You thought about shifting the house over to comply, and working with the applicant to really identify what is driving the location decision in this area, and can we do anything to change that request. And a second example on the next slide would show maybe something very different. And so in this case, we have a very oddly shaped piece of property. Maybe there's a wetland on there. We see a place where the new house is only 2 feet from the lot line, but in this case, it may be that this was the only location they could really put the house, and it's a small encroachment, whereas the last example was the whole side of the house. This one is just a corner of it. So again, these will be, you're going to see like probably very different things each time you get a request, which is really the purpose for the ZBA being in existence anyway. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see in making your decision, the ZBA should consider the location of the property, the use of surrounding properties, the use of the structure in relation to the zoning district in which it's located, and any other interest that you think is important as you're considering making a decision. And so, again, we do have public hearings for these before actions. And in addition to those, with the dimensional variances, there may be variances for non-conforming lot provisions. We did have a case on this with respect to the non-conformities last year, where the ZBA was asked to consider the type of non-conformity that was existing with the property. And one path would preclude them from expanding, and the other path would allow them to expand. So that's another interesting request. Not something that we get terribly often. I don't remember another one actually in several years before that. So the interpretations of the zoning ordinance are the responsibility of the ZBA. If we kind of go back to the interpretations of there. And then once we make those interpretations, that becomes the official standard. So we want to make sure that when we do make these determinations, that we're being clear in the motions, and that those are being kept as records on file. And then I'll go back into the other types of variances, the use variances. You may grant use variances, and they are only approved by a 2/3 majority of the ZBA. In this case, the applicant would show that the strict application of the ordinance would result in an unnecessary hardship. And that would mean that the property could not otherwise be put to a reasonable use. So something else that's permitted in that district is just not possible. And that the hardship is not self-created, it's due to unique circumstances, that any new use would be in character with surroundings, and the variance is the minimum necessary. I think that generally speaking, we discourage the use variance. It's very difficult for someone to establish to any level of satisfaction that that no other use is viable. That's the ordinance provides for quite a few numbers of uses in every district. And so we would find that that's generally not a good path to take. That there's reasons why uses aren't included within specific districts. And so we try to avoid those. I don't know if you want to add in anything.
I was just gonna say the example of that is like when a commercial property owner will come in and say, I have to use this parcel as a drive-through and our ordinance doesn't allow for it. Well, there's a plethora of other opportunities to utilize that commercial property within the confines of the zoning ordinance. So Joe's right. And then just, I wanted to add with the dimensional type variance request, it's really important to incorporate the standards that are set forth in the zoning ordinance when making a decision or a motion, primarily on the motion, because she did reference it before, but the fact finding is that function of the ZBA is extremely important, and having a good record of why you made the decision or why you did grant the variance or why you didn't is extremely important, because if it goes to the next step, which would be an appeal to the circuit court, then that record or that decision that the ZBA made is what the basis of that appeal, and ultimately the basis of the city's either defense or prosecution of that enforcement would be. So very important to review the ordinance and include that in your fact finding when you are stating your motion and stating your rationale for your decision.
But, and I'll remind you of those things again shortly. If you want to skip up to slide 30, I think I'm going to skip the next couple of slides where we get to zoning board of appeals meetings. We'll actually go one more. For scheduling meetings, generally we have a set meeting date. We have to have a quorum, a majority of the members, just like you do for your council meetings. And then the regularly scheduled meetings can be canceled less than 18 hours before the start of the meeting. So those are similar to the meeting standards that you have as council as well. If we go to the next slide, we'll see the notice requirements. So like we do for the planning commission does for public hearing notices, for the ZBA, we have a notice requirement. So we have a 15-day notice requirement, and those go to the owners of the property that are subject in question, and then everyone that is within 300 feet of that. This is important for our meeting deadlines to be aware of that when we have applicants that come in, to understand that it's not just you to get your stuff on the agenda, you just submit your things, that we have to go through it, make sure it's all accurate and the information is there. And then we have this notice requirement that we need to make sure that we have out. So the next one is just a little bit more of the detail on that, which I think I'll skip. The noticing requirements again are really just, and I've skipped their next one, describing the nature of requests so that the neighbors have a little bit of an idea of what is being requested, the property that's the subject of the request, when and where the request will be considered, and how people can provide their feedback for that. So go on to the next one. So this is really important, the Open Meetings Act information. I know that you've talked about this from council standpoint. We talked about it with Planning Commission. Open Meetings Act has been around for a while, really there to promote government transparency. And it requires that a meeting of a public body must be made open to the public, and decisions of the public body have to be made at an open meeting. We have to make sure that we're creating, accommodating the general public with reasonable accommodations, with ample notification. And now that we've gone through the pandemic, and we've had the legislation that allowed us to have those remote meetings over the last year and a half, it ended at the end of last year. That was something that was different, but it was modified in a way to still continue to afford the public the opportunity to participate. Some communities have ended that and are just, all in person again. But it's good to see that communities like Lathrup Village are providing a hybrid approach to at least allow people the opportunity to participate, or just to even just view. So I think that's really great that you're continuing to do that, despite the complications that are associated with it. So if we go to the next slide, conducting the ZBA meetings, again, all meetings must be in compliance with the Open Meetings Act. The ZBA should conduct business according to your adopted rules, your bylaws. Beginning on time and following the written agenda is important. All comments should be directed through the chairperson. All deliberations should be in the open. It's probably harder for that to happen here, especially with your screenings too, but not holding private conferences during the meeting. It can be distracting. And even if you're not really talking about anything related to the case, if you're saying like, gosh, it's really hot in here. If you're whispering that to someone, that may have the appearance that you're conducting some other kinds of side conversations. We want to try to avoid that. Express your opinions. And I would have added to this, I should have, ask questions. So you really want to make sure that you have all the information that you need to be able to make a decision, and then express your opinions, and then focusing on the request that's being made. So the chairperson's role is to maintain order throughout the meeting, enforce the meeting procedures, ensure courtesy is maintained and speakers are not interrupted. The last one, I think that's a little bit extreme about compelling witnesses and things like that. We don't typically see that kind of thing, but I guess that's part of the state statute. And so for the public hearings themselves, having the ground rules for the public hearing, I think are really important. There are times where you'll see a lot of people come out for a meeting, whether they're in person or if they're participating online. And there'll be times where you don't really see anybody. When you do have a big crowd that turns out for something, you may have a heads up about it. You may just know from your talking with your friends and neighbors in the community that something's going to be controversial. So it's helpful to describe those ground rules, and that's really to help run and ensure a smooth meeting. So the speakers should address the chairperson. Comments should be brief and to the point. I think we do have a 3-minute time limit in general here, which I think is really important. Speakers should be reminded, and unfortunately, we do have to remind folks at the outset sometimes to be courteous and respectful. It doesn't hurt to just remind folks. And then there really should be only be addressing one ZBA one time. So if they say something, unless it's up to the chairperson, if you would like to allow another person to speak a second time, but explain that once everybody's had a chance to participate, and only if it's something new information, we don't need to stand up and repeat the same things again. It's just to make sure that we're respecting everyone's time and we're moving items along in a quick way. And then for the next slide, for additional guidelines, it's really important to not engage in debate with audience members. It can be hard when people are questioned. Maybe they'll point a question at somebody directly, but then it's up to the chair or to you as ZBA members to just defer to the chair of the ZBA and wait until there's a question that's actually asked. That can be very hard sometimes if there's a lot going on. But we haven't really had very many controversial items as of late for the ZBA, I would say. Yeah. So, and then once the public hearing is closed, all the comments should come from the ZBA members themselves. So that's the time when you all have the opportunity to talk amongst yourselves, ask additional questions. You may ask the applicant questions. You may ask a neighbor of the subject property questions, just to get clarification if something if there's something that would help you make your decision better. And then once the motion is made and seconded, this is on the next one, all comments from that point should be at the motion at hand. And then in that motion, again, referring to any findings of fact that you have, include the ordinance from which the variance is being requested, and as detailed as you can be, whether you're approving it or not approving it. And then the chairperson should repeat the motion and then ask for the vote. And then once the vote's taken, the matter's done, the next item on the agenda should be presented. There doesn't need to be any kind of additional deliberation or discussion on that. When we think about public meetings, we like to offer our tips for orderly public meetings. It doesn't hurt to have, and I think you may have the public participation rules printed somewhere on the back of the agenda or at the bottom of the agenda. And if you don't, that might be something that we want to think about adding to all of the meeting agendas. And those would be some of the things that we just talked about. Note that every question does not have to be answered. Sometimes they're just not relevant. Sometimes you cannot answer them. Sometimes they're really rhetorical questions that don't really need to have be answered. But it's helpful to say that up front. So we'll take all of if we see a big hearing with a lot of people that come out and want to ask their questions or speak their comments, just to make a list. And then at the end, we'll answer all the questions that we can instead of doing them as they come, because that can really drag meetings out and take up a lot of time that's not necessary. If things get out of hand, you can always take a recess and not feel compelled to make a decision the night of the hearing if you think that the postponement would lead to a more informed decision. So this is where we like to remind you that particularly if something is controversial, don't just postpone the meeting because you don't want to make a decision in front of the crowd that's with you. If you feel like you can make a decision, like nothing's really going to change, if you wait a month, you can make it at that time and just take care of it. If you feel though that there's additional information that you need to make a decision and the applicant doesn't have it handy, then that's an appropriate thing to make a postponement with the specification in your motion to postpone of the information that you're asking the applicant to provide. Again, and it's, I think, worth reminding you, the ZBA represents the interests of the entire community and not just people who are at the public hearing. So a lot of times it's hard when you're faced with an angry group of folks, but remembering that there are many other people who don't come to the meeting. And so it's just something to keep in mind. Once the hearing is closed, though, on the agenda item, then the public should not be involved in the discussion at all, again, unless the chair asks for clarification on items. Again, for the motions, as we make the motions, we would have the motion includes the maker of the motion and who seconds the motion, the description of the request. So it might be to ask to grant a 2-foot waiver in the required 5-foot side yard setback. The action taken, approval, denial, or postponement, any conditions attached to the approval, which we'll talk about in a second. The reason for the action taken, so it's related to the review standards. So we find that this situation is not self-created, that there's a giant tree that's worth saving in the applicant's backyard that includes an addition, things of that nature. So we're talking about why we're granting it. And then referencing any staff reports that may be appropriate. It's helpful to make sure everybody's clear on the motion. So you may again want to repeat that as the chair, and then only entertaining one motion at a time. You can, as a ZBA, make a motion that includes conditions. So you could approve a variance request subject to certain conditions. They do need to be reasonable, which probably goes without saying, but I think it's helpful to think about what it is that we are concerned about with respect to a project that might have dimensional encroachment. So maybe it's noise related, and maybe we would suggest have a condition that some screening go around whatever that is. Maybe it's a garage. We ask for additional screening because that's related to the protection of the neighbors while still allowing the improvement to take place. Designed to protect natural resources, health, safety, and welfare, and the well-being of the users, residents, landowners, and community, related to a valid exercise of the police power and necessary to meet the intent and purpose of the ordinance. So we're not going to make a condition, but something that's really related to both the project at hand and the ordinances that are associated with them. And then the motion should ensure who's responsible to ensure that conditions are implemented. So for example, if we say, if we use the screening as an example, with the screening to be approved by the building official, then that lets everybody know whose responsibility it is. And if you're going to include a condition like that, then you can even be a little bit more specific about the kind of, if it matters to the case, the kind of screening that we're talking about. Low evergreen screening, that might be sufficient to give them a little bit of direction. So we've got a sample motion. We'll include this back for you, but generally this is pertaining to granting a variance for a home that might be encroaching into the 5-foot setback. And so we talk here about how the practical difficulty is not self-created. This might refer us back to that example of the funny shaped lot with the wetland in it, where we would say unique circumstances of the lot, specifically the unusual shape of the lot and presence of unbuildable areas elsewhere on this lot. That we would say it does substantial justice to the applicant by allowing the construction of a home similar to those on surrounding lots. It wouldn't necessarily be reasonable to ask an applicant to construct a home that is significantly smaller than the neighboring homes in a case where we might be able to grant a variance. That we don't think that the improvement would have an unnecessary or a negative impact on surrounding properties, and that the applicant is requesting the smallest possible variance. And maybe we had the last one where we said the approval is conditioned on the placement of all noise generating equipment in other yards than the eastern side yards. We know we've reduced the setback that's permitted on one side. We don't want to add in the additional burden of the mechanical equipment. So we may say that has to go on the other side. So that would be an example of a condition that would be reasonable in this case. There could be a case where, if we were looking at the first one, where we had that just very simple rectangle property, that we would say we deny the variance, that the practical difficulty is self-created and not due to any unique circumstances of the lot. particularly given its regular shape and flat surface. That the granting of the variance may have an impact on surrounding properties, and that the applicant has not demonstrated any other alternatives were considered that would allow the home to be built in conformance with the ordinance or with the smallest possible variance. And so those would be a couple of different options, but the reasons for those, either the approval or denial of a variance, would be very important in your motion. These are not valid reasons to grant a variance. So following the ordinance would be expensive for the applicant. That's generally not to be considered a good reason to grant a variance. No one objected. That may be true that current property owners don't have an issue with a project, but we also have to be thinking ahead to remember that future people may have an issue. The applicant already built it. That's a tough one. And it can be hard for community to rectify that. Although I have worked with communities where improvements were made and the ZBA made a denial, and that improvement had to go. And so that does happen. I don't like that standard of the zoning ordinance. You might not like it, but it's there. And so we have to follow it. However, if you don't like it, that's information that would be worth sharing with the planning commission. So the planning commission, who has that responsibility of looking at ordinance language, might also share those same feelings and think about, are there other ways we can get at the same goal? What are we trying to accomplish by this standard in the ordinance? And so what is it that we don't like? Is there some way that we can change it to either eliminate it altogether or modify it in a way that seems to be more practical? We trust that the applicant will do a good job, or the applicant really needs to get started soon, or the applicant didn't know about that standard. We have to ensure that people know what they're getting into when they get started. So we do the best that we can with giving people the information that they need in a way that they can find it. Everything is available on the city's website. And we always encourage folks to really take a look at the ordinance before they submit their projects. Keep in mind that again, we have all those for minutes and adjournment. Those are approved by the majority of those people present. Let's skip to the next one. So the concurring vote of the majority of the ZBA members is required to pass a motion, and appeals to any decision of the ZBA are then going to circuit court. Rehearing the same case of the ZBA after a denial cannot occur unless there's a substantive change in the requested variance of appeal. So for example, if this case we had the home that had the 3-foot encroachment, if they redesigned their project and they came back with 1.5 foot encroachment, that might be something that the ZBA would then reconsider. The recordings of the minutes are filed at the city. Variances do run with the land, so it's really important to have a record on file of everything. These do go into the city's BSNA system, and so we are able to track them from property, over time, any variances that may have been granted. It is a good idea to check for existing variances on a property when a new application is submitted, so that we know what's happened in the past. And then the next slide is just about compliance and follow-up. Are there any questions at this point?
I have one.
Yes.
I think I know the answer to it, but I want to ask it just because we have something coming up next month. It's going to be somewhat similar, but obviously the hardship can't be self-created. But when you purchase a home, you inherit the self-creations, correct? So for example, if I buy a house that has a deck on it and I want to put a air conditioner, I can't put an air conditioner in the backyard because I've got a deck and I want to have variance, so I can put it on the side lot. That's still considered self-created, correct?
I'll defer to Scott to answer that. It's kind of, it's a little bit of both, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, in that scenario, the city allows for residents to have a deck in their backyard. It's not like they inherited a pond or something like that. Would be a little bit different. So, and again,
it's a case by case
yeah,
thing.
it's a case by
it really
case.
is going to vary depending on the situation of the home, the size of the deck, the location of it, and if there's really no other location. I mean, the question might be, to Scott's point about, if the other homes in the neighborhood have decks and this house has a deck, is it reasonable to ask this homeowner to remove the deck completely, to put in the air conditioner. Do other homes in the neighborhood have air conditioners? Probably. So it may be something where you're kind of looking at the context of all the other homes.
And the other thing to do in that type of a scenario, and Jill references, is to look back through the city's records and see, has this request come up before? If it has, how was it addressed at that point in time? And one of the key factors is to remain consistent with what you do, because arbitrary and capricious decisions are not upholdable. So that's an important component. And that's generally where your consultants will come in. Planner and myself will say, okay, we've had 2 or 3 requests on the same issue, and this is how the city has proceeded previously. These were the facts in those cases, and they're either similar or dissimilar to what we're looking at in this particular case. That's something else I was gonna say. I went in one.
Well, I was thinking of something while you were talking, which was about not to be overly concerned about precedent setting necessarily. Because even if you do grant a variance for one air conditioner and one side yard for a certain property with certain findings of fact, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to apply in the next case. You know, it's,
Yeah,
so we
that-
look to the past for some of the, to be consistent, and yet we're not saying, well, you granted one 3 doors down. Well, that might have been a completely different situation.
And that's why it's very important to make that detailed finding of fact when you are making your decision. I remember what the other thing was now, and you did reference it earlier. It was, the example was the tough sheds we had a few
Yeah.
years ago. If the city starts to receive multiple requests for the same variance from the same provision, then that's also an indicator that it might be time to take a look at what our standards are and revisit those for potential amendments.
Right. The ordinances are written, you know, most of the ordinances were written many, many years ago. But the zoning ordinance is a living document, and we do update it from time to time, you know, as things come up. So things change in the way that we live, the way we work, and so sometimes we do need to make adjustments to the ordinances with respect to setbacks and things of that nature. All right, the last-
What's coming next month?
It's just a ZBA request or the resident that's requesting a variance.
Oh, isn't something you all know, should know
We
about?
will. I mean, I was contacted directly by the resident, that's why I know about it.
Oh,
So the next few slides are, just to wrap it up, etiquette and procedures. So this gets into whether your roles as, when it's a little bit different, your role as a council and the ZBA, you are participating in this, but you remember that your role is, in this case, is as the ZBA and not as council. We do try to look at some of the standards for if we have a conflict of interest or things like that. Let's switch on to the next one. Actually, I'm going to switch to the next one because we don't have alternates here. The conflict of interest, though, is the next slide. So it is not unusual in a community where you live that and serve on the board that you may have conflicts of interest arise. So if there's a remote possibility that your decision could benefit a ZBA member personally, it's important to share that with the ZBA. And then if it's you, perhaps recuse yourself from consideration of the issue. If you're not sure whether you should recuse yourself or not, it's good to check with the city attorney to clear that. Really, one of the primary points is if you stand to benefit financially from the outcome of the case, that's definitely a conflict of interest. It could be a family member, it could be somebody that you work with. There can be varying lines of whether there may be a conflict or not. I think just disclosing that, even if you believe that you don't have a conflict of interest and that you can render an impartial decision, an objective decision, just saying it for the record, this is a friend of mine, we serve on the garden club together, but I think I can be objective in this case, just to let people know. If you are recused, though, it's best practice to not participate in any of the discussion. It is depending on the community and the recommendations of the attorney. Even good idea to leave the room if you feel like you have it. Just having a presence in the room can sometimes throw people off. I think you've got that in your bylaws, and you've got a whole section on conflict of interest in the ordinance, I believe. Anything you want to add on that one?
No, I think you pretty well touched on all of it. In the past, we haven't made people leave the room if there is an issue, but I agree, not participating in the discussion, especially certainly not making the motion, is appropriate if there is that issue.
If you go to the next slide, just a couple, and I sort of said this already, conflicts if you're the applicant or a close relative is the applicant, a business associate or a close personal friend, potentially. And again, you can have that conversation. Just the last couple, email communication. This is just one that we put into this next slide, put into all of our trainings for ZBA and Planning Commission. There's no reason to have any kind of communication happening via email. Even if it's a passive comment, even if it may not violate technically the Open Meetings Act, it's just really best practice to not discuss ZBA matters outside of the ZBA meeting. And so, when we get a note, maybe your agenda packet, please don't ever reply all with a question or with a comment about anything. You'll get I think, probably a very rapid response to all saying do not reply to all. And I just had this happen in another community where I thanked someone for making a comment and I said, please don't reply all. And then I immediately got back a reply all from somebody telling me thank you. Okay, good, thanks. It can be tempting. It's just, you're trying to be courteous. You want to kind of clear things up. If you have a question, it's best to direct that to staff or to Scott before the meeting. And if you do have questions before the meeting, it's definitely worth shooting an email out to staff or to Scott just to clarify something. If there's information that maybe the applicant can provide ahead to help you with your decision at the meeting, I think that's great. Anything you want to add on that one?
No, going back to the conflict thing, it just made me think, just because you are on this body doesn't mean you can't request a variance yourself as a resident. So you're not sacrificing that ability by sitting on council in the ZBA. So.
Right, good point. Right, absolutely. That's why we have multiple people on the ZBA. Conducting site visits, we just have a couple more slides. I think this is really helpful to, if you can go by the project that's going to be discussed. Don't enter the site without permission from the property owner. If you do ask them if you could see if maybe it's something in the backyard and you're just curious, you can contact them about that. We should not ever have a quorum gathering at the applicant's home at any time. Avoid commenting on anything. Really, you're just there to see the project, see the potential improvements, see the context, what's happening with the neighbors, how close are we to the street, looking at those key things that you think would be helpful. It's good. You can see the things written, the written materials that'll be in your packets. You can see the 2D version of the plan, but it's helpful to go see everything in person too, just to give you a feel for what's happening in the area. Again, for the ZBA, it's just best practices to, like we said, follow your procedures, in every case, be consistent. I think consistency is probably one of the most important things. Avoiding conflicts of interest, keep good records, make strong motions that record your reasons for taking a given action, and treat all the applicants the same way. It's really essential. So that's it. And I'm happy to answer any other questions that you might have, or any questions for Scott. So anything else you want to add?
One of the MML trainings that I went to a few years ago, they talked about on the variance application, they have a lot of communities that when the applicant signs the variance request, they also are giving permission for the ZBA members to look at the issue in person. Have we ever thought about doing that here?
I think that's a great idea. If we haven't yet, I think I feel like we did talk about that.
I brought it up
So
about 3
I
years
think
ago.
so.
We never
I don't know
got
that we did
that
in
done.
the past, but I think it's a good idea to make note of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's good for site plan reviews too. It could be the cover of the application that you allow that when you are making an application for anything. Yeah, it's a good idea. Any other questions from our newer ZBA members? And it's kind of,
So your your PowerPoint was pretty detailed. Is that all in the 2 pages or the few pages that we have in?
most of the
Okay,
highlights are, yes, about making motions and conflicts of interest and communication. I think so.
okay,
But we can share the rest of this with you too.
okay. Thank you. But one last question. So, let's see if I can remember. So when we talked about if a person built it already, but they have to take it down, and so we need to go and make sure that, you know, the follow-up basically, that would be with Giffords and Webster, right?
And we would
Or-
probably, if it was something like that, it would likely be the building official.
Okay.
And that doesn't come up very often. Because typically will have been a building permit,
Right.
and then usually those things are identified before the building permit. Not always, sometimes things do fall through the cracks, but
Anybody got anything else? Oh, well, thanks, Joe. Appreciate it.
thank you.
All right, so we will move on to the next item on the agenda, which is our sanitary sewers. About a year ago, we did televising and cleaning of about 32,000 linear feet. And in the capital improvement bond, we budgeted for roughly about $500,000 of subsequent repairs that would be based on the televising of those 32,000 linear feet. So that televising has been done, it's been analyzed, and Scott Ringler, our city engineer, is here to talk about that. So take it away, Scott.
I'm sure this is the subject everyone came for tonight.
Better than sewer backup.
So as Bruce said, in 2020, the city went out for bids to do about 32,000 linear feet of sanitary sewer cleaning and televising. That work was completed in the winter of 2021. It took them about 6 months to do. And since then, we've been evaluating what we call assessing the sewer system itself. So we get videotapes, we go through and analyze them. We rank them. Is there any way to put this on screen? If not, you guys all have
We all
the
have it, we
report?
all have
Okay, we'll just go through the report quick. So on the first page, and I wish I would have numbered these pages, the 3 different types of sewers that we looked at were sewers that we had no known condition of that sewer. The second one was sewers that we actually knew were in good condition, but that was back in the 1990s, so it was over 20 years ago. And then the third one is some of these sewers back in the 90s, the joints were grouted, which is basically forcing grout into all the joints that don't hold pressure to try to fill the leaks that are in there with grout. So then were the 3 different types of sewers that we looked at. And as far as the assessment, so the sewer company that does the analysis and the videotaping rates the sewers. And they give it, a grade 5 is a really bad defect. It's a broken pipe. It might be a collapse. All the way down to a grade 1, which is a minor defect. Subsequently, we get them numbers, and then I go through and actually review all these videotapes, and I give it my own assessment. Same thing, basically a condition 5, which is going to be page 6. Which a condition 5, it's in really bad structural condition. Condition 4, it's in poor condition. There could be some flow restrictions. There could be a lot of roots, mineral deposits. Condition 3 is where flow may be impeded. There may be some root intrusions, some mineral deposits. All the way down to condition 1, where it's in really good condition. So if you look at the chart that's on there, I only made a sample of this, but there's a column called structural, column called operational and maintenance, and then an overall. So these conditions here is what the sewer company rates. So that first one, 00 to 1-53, is a 10-inch pipe, it's 125 foot long. The pipe rating is a 4. The pipe rating index is a 4, is what I look at as the quick rating. So that 4100 is the 2 worst conditions on that sewer pipe. So the worst condition is a 4, and the next number is a 1. So that means there was only one condition 4 defect on that pipe. And then there was no other defects on that pipe. Under operation and maintenance, which is usually roots, cleanliness, mineral deposits, a few other different defects that are in a pipe, there was none. So in other words, that pipe's in pretty good condition with the exception of that one number 4 defect. And if you look at the 2020 GW ratings, that's my rating. So I rated that as a 4. The next column is the number of services. I like to keep track of them. But our recommendation on that one is a PR, which is a point repair. We actually got to go in and do an excavation to fix that.
Scott, can you define what number of services is? Because I'm
Oh,
sure a
it's,
lot of people don't
so
know what
that,
that is.
that 125 foot of sewer doesn't have any residential services connected to it. The next one, you'll see a number 5. It has 5 residents or businesses connections to it. So we think we did 120 sewer segments that we went through and rated. So the next sheet, which is going to be 7, page 7. So out of the 32,000 feet of sewers that were assessed, about 9% of them were what we classified as condition 5. 13.5% were condition 4. About 33% were condition 3. 25% were condition 2, and about 20% were condition 1 sewers. So, and then you know, I have a chart there that talks about each of the different ones, the unknowns, the knowns, and the previously grouted. They all ranked about the same as far as conditions 1 through 5 for each of them different types of sewers. And then the next sheet is basically just a graph of what the conditions came out to be. So some of our observations, about 45% were condition 1 or 2 with no work required at this time. About 33% of the sewers were assessed at condition 3. Some of them we recommend to do cured in place pipes. Some of them we just want to monitor. So monitoring means the next time we do a sanitary sewer evaluation, we should be re-looking at them. And that's usually, we've been doing about every 10 years on these sewers. About 22% of the sewers were assessed as a condition 4 or 5, in which we're recommending cured in place pipe. And the majority of these sewers are easement sewers, so they're in people's backyards. Very difficult to get to sometimes. Unfortunately, we find fences built on them, garages really close. They're not easily accessible.
Can you define for everyone the cured and pipe process?
Okay, so cured in place pipe is a trenchless technology where you're actually inverting. It's really an inversion of a resin-filled belt/vinyl bag. So when I say it's trenchless, they go from one manhole and they invert the bag all the way to the end of the manhole. Okay, and then they not inject, but they have hot water that goes into it. That hot water is heated to about 180 degrees, which starts to cure the resins. So once that resin is cured, it turns into like a PVC pipe, really, really hard. Them pipes are usually 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch in diameter. So it's a 50-year design. It's really a great process. It takes about a day to do these, and you're in and out with no excavation. Once that pipe is cured, then they go through and they actually cut out everybody's service. With that water pressure, it indents where your service lead is because there's a little hole there. So they're able to find them indentations and they cut them out.
So although they're in like people's backyards, you said it's hard to get to. are you gonna have trouble even though it's trenchless or?
They do have equipment back there. There shouldn't be any excavation. There shouldn't be any excavation unless we gotta make a point repair. They can't do every sewer like that. If there's a really bad collapse, we gotta fix that collapse before they can do the inversion.
Okay.
A couple other things. We also evaluated, there's some large diameter sanitaries along westbound 11 Mile and also Evergreen. Fortunately, them were in really good condition, other than they were really dirty. There was up to 6 to 10 inches of debris in them sewers, so it really reduced the capacity of the sewer system. And then we also, and we know of these, we had quite a few sewers that have no manhole at the upper end. We really, to do the inversion, you got to have a manhole at each end. So as part of our recommendation is to start constructing some upper end manholes. So on page. Well, the next page under our recommendation.
Page
So
9.
we are recommending out of the 32,000 feet of sewers that about 11,000 of them be repaired with cured in place pipe. That's a little over 2 miles of sewer repairs. And also to install 5 upper end manholes to support the lining of these sewers. And then on the first page of the pictures, I tried to put a few of these pictures on what we run into. The interesting one, and I think Bruce touched on this a couple of weeks ago, the top left one. So the Rummel drain was installed on the east side of the high school, and it runs from 12 Mile down to almost 11 Mile. It cuts down Evergreen, just north of Saratoga. But it's interesting because that top left sewer actually runs through the Rummel drain. They built the Rummel drain around it. And the best I can spot out, you can see that break in the bottom of the pipe. I think that's right in the Rummel drain. So when the Rummel drain starts to head up too far above this pipe, cracked pipe, all that water is going through this cracked pipe and directly into the retention.
That's a big thing. You didn't mention that, but a lot of the cure in place originally started because of an influx of stormwater into our sanitary system, and the city pays per gallon for sanitary to get rid of that sanitary water that goes through our tank. So that's largely in part why this program was started.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note when you were talking earlier about the grouting that took place with the Packer. I mean, that's the same thing. It's to seal those the grouts between pipes so that water doesn't seep into the sanitary sewer pipes and go to our tank, and then we have to pay to get rid of it.
So we popped a few manholes the last few weeks. We don't think the Rummel's headed up enough to get into that pipe, but with the rain event we had like last Thursday, we didn't see that much more flow coming through there. So we're trying to keep an eye on that. The one just underneath that are some of the sewers we found with roots. Them are roots that it's in the sewer system. The middle two. So you can see there's a lot of roots that come through the joints. They're thirsty. They're trying to find water, and that's where they're getting it at. The bottom two pictures, the bottom left is actually an upper end manhole, but it's really not a manhole. It's a 6-inch pipe that comes up to grade. So that's something that we're going to have to excavate and put a real manhole there. The bottom right, these are basically, contractors, they tap their sewers, they push this pipe way in there. We call it a protruding tap. Our video camera can't get past that. And then when you do need to line that, they got to cut that down. So there's more expense there. So them are things when, the building official goes out and reviews these when they're doing these sewer taps to keep an eye on.
So Scott, and I guess maybe this is Scott and Susie, when we have instances, obviously that's against code when they have their taps that go into the sanitary line. When we encounter those, do we bill back the particular resident, or do we just eat that cost?
Well, we haven't. That's an extreme case there, and that's a PVC pipe. That's hard to cut.
Yeah.
The one right before that, you can see I mean, it's barely protruding, but it's a clay pipe, so when they go to pre-clean this sewer, with the equipment they have, they just this equipment whips around that pipe, it breaks it off really clean. The PVC one might be a little more of an issue. But fortunately, you know, knowing the sewer, the location, the lineal foot, I can tell you exactly where that sewer is and who owns it. The next page, the top ones are, so these are some of your residents' sewer leads. Not only does the city sewer get a lot of leads, but so do the residents' leads. You can see them, some of them are almost fully impacted. The middle pictures, these are sewers that have a lot of debris. So them black stripes that are there, that was all debris that's built up. So part of doing this cleaning and televising, we were able to clean all these sewers. The bottom ones are actually pipes that were in good condition. The bottom left is a concrete pipe, and the bottom right one is a clay pipe. And the last page is actually one that was actually had cured in place pipe already installed. That we videotaped. It looked like it wasn't really good condition, other than you can see all the black there. That's all debris that's in that sewer. With that, we prepared a cost estimate. It's our estimated cost that the lining is going to be about $665,000. The 5 manhole installation is about $46,000 for a total estimated cost of about $711,000. In which, when we put together the bond this year, we're estimating about $480,000 in cost. With that, we would like to go out to bids. We'll get some bids back in probably the next 4 to 6 weeks. Come back to council with the recommendations, see what kind of numbers come in at. With that, I'll take any questions.
Scott, this is it? This is the project?
I'm
No.
sorry that I didn't realize when I printed out the packets that there were oddly shaped pages that were included in there. So I'm sorry about that.
Much done.
And I apologize too, because the maps I give Susie are really big maps and they're hard to kind of show on a 8.5 by 11.
It shows up appropriately in the electronic packet though. So sorry about that. It's hard to catch. sometimes.
One corner.
Do you have is it on there where the 5 manhole covers are going? Or where you were
Oh, boy,
suggesting
it
them?
might be, we're gonna have to search for them.
And are they going, road? Are they going on the property? Where do you
A little
typically
of
put them? Okay,
Uh,
I'd like to see that and what they look like.
It's a manhole, it's a 4-foot diameter manhole. They're usually as deep as the sewer. The sewers are usually 8 to 10 foot deep. They're below the basements.
I think we have, what, 15, 18 of these in our capital improvement plan?
No, well, I think we still have about 30 of them
30
to
of them,
do.
okay.
We just need 5 to do this. It's actually 4 upper ends. There's 1 intermediate. Actually, the property just north of the school, they actually have a 10-inch sewer that runs underneath the school. And that sewer is 680 feet long. So we want to put it intermediate.
Yeah, so I guess the point I was making is that by completing those 5, we're knocking off some of what's on our capital improvement plan as well.
I'll have to get you them locations. They're on the yellow map, but you have to,
Yeah, I found a couple.
the green ones, the sewers we want to line. So you got to correlate the green ones with where there's a manhole needed.
They're on there. They're pink and
Yep,
blue.
Thank you.
I think the city back in 08 or 09 did about 30 of these manholes too. It's a difficult project. Here in people's backyards, there's trees. We try to get it out into the right of way. That's, can't always do that.
All right, thanks, Scott.
If there's no other questions, can I add one more thing?
Yeah, please.
So the storm sewer system, and if you recall, the city got a grant for $200,000 to the storm sewer cleaning and televising. That project's out for bid. Bids are due March 15th. So I'm suspecting probably the later meeting in March will bring that recommendation to council, see what the bids come in at.
Okay. Anybody have anything else? Okay, last item on the agenda is the discussion of backfilling. So this is what we've talked about in the last two meetings, about potentially backfilling the water customers, the 70 or so water customers who have 1.5-inch meters, where we had the erroneous reads for about 4 years, where we were doing 4-digit reads and basing the billing on 4-digit reads versus 5-digit reads. I did put together, I know there was a little confusion in some of the discussions we had last time. And I'll get that. To better explain, the issue, we talked about it a little bit, but one of the issues that we started to talk about was the difficulty of determining how many units to backfill. And when Pam put together her spreadsheet for us a few weeks ago, basically what she did is she looked at the last known 5-digit read for a given customer, and then looked at the first 5-digit read after the customer was billed the first time after the correction, and then subtracted out those two, and that's how we determined how many units of water they actually used. And then we went through that same period and looked at how many did we actually bill them for, and we could subtract the one from the other to determine, how many units do they need to be backfilled for. But where the difficulty came in is, and I think where some of the confusion in our discussion came in, was when we go to apply a rate against that number of units, the problem that we have is that because we only have 4-digit reads, we can't determine how many of those units were in year 1, year 2, year 3, and year 4. And so what we had talked a little bit about, or at least I had proposed to talk to Scott about, was billing them the lowest unit cost over those 4 years. That way we're guaranteeing the fact that we're not overbilling anybody. So what this diagram that I put together kind of shows is above the line is the 5-digit read. So that's the actual read off of the meter, regardless of whether it was erroneously read by our system as 4 digits or 5 digits. And below the line is the actual 4-digit reading that we would then record in the system. So for example, at the very beginning on the far left, you've got a meter that's reading 10,000. And then at the end of year 1, it's reading 10,120. So the meter actually shows 10,120, but what we would be taking off of the read with 4 digits is the 1012. And now if you go forward to the end of year 2, so now the meter reads 10,229. So again, that's exactly what's on the meter. So if you subtract those two, you see that they've actually used 109 units of water. But if you look at the 4-digit reads below, you go from 1012 to 1022. And so if you subtract those, you can come out with 10. And if you want to try to figure out, how much they use in that year, you could say, all right, well, we can try to multiply by 10 to compensate for that missing digit. But when you do that, you come out with 100. And so in this particular case, they've actually used 109 units. But we would only be billing them for 100. So they would be basically getting 9 units for free. And then the next example, it actually flips the other way around. So you've got 10,229 for the beginning read. And at the end of year 3, you're at 10,330. So again, subtracting that, that's 101 units that were actually used. But again, if you use the 4-digit reads and subtract the 1022 from the 1033, you get 11. So we would bill them for 110. So in this case, we'd be billing them for 10 units, 9 units more than they actually use. So the issue is because of the 4-digit reads, and correct me if I'm wrong, Pam, you can't figure for any given period how many units they use in that particular period. Right. So
You can't add just a 0 to the If they had, if it was 4, you can't say it was 40.
Well, that's what I'm showing here.
Well, I see what you're showing there, but I went through, did several of them, and it was pretty close. So to disregard that and go with the lowest unit, lowest rate, that doesn't,
I don't know what you're saying. So the lowest. Again, the issue, and again, Pam, correct me if I'm wrong, you can't really figure out, I mean, you can come close within 9 units, right? Because for each given period that you take up based on a 4-digit read, you have a potential of plus or minus 9 units of error. So you can get close, but the problem is how do you tell somebody that you're billing them, oh, we think you were around 100 units?
Well, the other thing too is just adding the 0. One billing, they might have been at 0, but the next billing, they were at 10, then they'd be at 0, then they'd be at 10. So how do you figure that out when you're billing somebody 0 so that you're billing them a 4 unit for one billing period, and then the next billing period, they're being billed 10 units.
but there were some people that were billed for, they were billed for 0 units. Oh, because the ones I was going through were 4, 5, and if you made it 40 and 50, that about.
But
came
that's,
out.
I think, and that's why it got changed, because depending on the multiplier, there were people that were being billed 0 or 10, 0 or 10. And
I
those
think-
are the ones that we had the problems with, that were coming in complaining.
Yeah, and then just in terms of the rate, I mean, we're not talking, the fact that we'd be charging them the lowest rate, I mean, the difference between the lowest and the current rate is only about $1 a unit. And looking at, so for example, if we could come out with some way of figuring out the amount per year. So for example, in year 1, you see I've got the number, the actual rate under each year. So in year 1, if we do charge the lowest rate, so in year 1, there's no loss whatsoever because we're charging them the rate that was in effect in that year. In the next year, it goes up about 2%. Third year, it goes up 4%. The fourth year, it goes up 6%. So if you look at the average across the 4 years, you're talking about 2.5% roughly. If you apply that to the $130,000 that we're looking to get back, you're talking about $3,000. So there's a potential loss here of about $3,000 out of $130,000 in recovery. So it's not a huge number. And again, there's really no way to figure out exactly how much to apply to each of the individual rates. So you can't do it anyway. So if you charge them the lowest rate, then again, it's not a huge difference. And it's, I mean, Scott, we talked about this earlier, it's legally defensible because we're not overcharging it. There's no potential of overcharging.
That's
But
the biggest.
we've overcharged other residents to make up for the shortfall.
How
So
have we done
that
that?
piece, excuse me,
How have we done that?
we didn't have to raise the rates to make up for $600,000 to $800,000 that was not billed.
I guess I'm not following how that applies to this,
All of the other residents' rates went up.
as did these residents.
Well, they're not going to be going up if you, for the underbilled amount.
Right, but again, we're talking about $3,000 to get back $130,000. So I don't know how else you would do it.
Okay, well.
I mean, I agree with you. I agree with you, Karen. I would love to be able to charge, 10 units times the $11 rate, 15 units times the $12 rate and so forth, but I don't know how you would do it. And again, our treasurer is telling us there's no way to do it as well, so.
Was every account, did you look at every account to see where this occurred? You go through every single account or?
They all fluctuated when they were done. And I even one time or talked to Bruce about it, that if somebody was in like, if it started, I'm just going to throw out a date. Let's say it started in 2011. If they were all charged this, but then somebody else might have started in 2012 or 2013, they should be at that rate at that time. So it's not, everybody's going to get the 11. It depends on when the older ones, the first year it was in effect, they would get the 11. But if somebody it didn't change until 2 years later, then they're going to get that rate into the 2-year rate that was in effect at that time.
Right, so that'll reduce the roughly $3,000 that we'll lose because, you know.
Right, but you
Okay,
have to
yeah,
take,
because some of them was, it didn't happen for 4 years, right? It happened for 2 years or 3
Right.
years or 1 year, whenever it
Right.
happened to be adjusted.
right,
So we're not going to take all of them back to 11.9.
No, no.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah.
Well, all
So
right,
so to be real
that's-
specific, like if somebody started in year 3 and year 4, you know, they're gonna go customer by customer. So that particular person, when I say the lowest rate, they would be charged $12.23 for all that they used in year 3 and year 4. So it's gonna reduce the amount that we're gonna lose.
Okay, that wasn't clear.
Yeah.
And then when you discovered this and you raised them back up, adding the 0 back on, were actual meter readings done at that point?
There were reads done through our system that went into the, when we did the reads, when we
The
went around.
drive-by?
Mhm. And if there were any problems, then we sent the gentleman out to do manual reading.
Okay, so did the majority of them match up?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay, okay. And then I did notice, what is happening with Michigan First? Theirs was, I don't see that theirs was ever adjusted back up.
I would have to look into that one because we have to look at every single account properly on this.
Okay, okay, so you are going to do that, but you haven't done that yet.
I have not had time to do it yet.
Okay, so there's a possibility that this could be
Could be different.
a lot more than $130,000. Okay,
Yeah,
well,
I
that
mean,
is a,
Explain that
Big
again.
one.
And I think Michigan First, I think they're a 2-inch or a 3-inch meter.
Right, 'cause
I think they have a larger meter than a 1.5-inch meter.
and that wasn't impacted? Well,
No,
if you go back, they went from 5 digits to 4 digits, so I wasn't sure what happened
I'll have to look at
There.
their meter size.
back quite some time ago, so,
I'll look at the meter size on that.
okay. And it doesn't show any indication of during the construction, which is when we had that big jump. And then when the building was finished, which, much larger, there is no indication that their bills went up or their usage went up at all during that time, so.
I think in one of our meetings, we talked about, it was a resident, I can't remember, but it was like, well, what if there was a line during that time period that somehow got in and wasn't going through the meter? But then again, how do you ever know that, right? I mean.
Well, if I analyze.
Right.
the
I
numbers.
mean, you've got to get through a lot of investigation, eliminating a lot of options. Scott, you were gonna say something before.
No, I was gonna echo your statement that it becomes more legally defensible, and if we're talking about $3,000, the city may spend more than $3,000 trying to justify the back billing at the various rates versus what they would ultimately recover, so.
I guess the other question I wanted to throw out to everybody and, with all the other things that we're doing right now, sidewalks, culvert replacements, everything, we've been giving people 2 years, allowing them to pay monthly and giving them 2 years, which to me seems reasonable given the amounts here. I don't know how other people feel about that. Whether it should be 1 year, whether it should be different than the 2 years, 3 years,
Well, could there be different options depending on how much is owed? I mean, there's some that owe a lot and some that don't owe a lot.
Yeah, what I did notice is for the most part, going through the list of 70, for the most part, residents were mostly under $2,000. It was the businesses and the condos that were over that.
Well, what's the difference with a condo being different than a residence?
Because again, correct me if I'm wrong, Pam, but my understanding is that sometimes the condos, the water is included in the condo, and so it goes through 1 meter.
It's included in the condo association. It can have 4 buildings in 1 meter.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, anybody have any thoughts on that? If it's 2 years or more time for businesses or more time based on a dollar amount?
I would say based on a dollar amount, if that's possible. But and based on the situation, some that might not be a big deal, others it might be a real hardship to, do it over 3 years. I don't know.
All right, and we'll go to mayor and council comment.
We have 5 minutes, or actually 3 minutes to do the mayor and council comments. So if there's anything that is pressing for the mayor and council comments, which I don't have anything now to say, but if any of the council has anything to say, if we can limit that so we can make sure that we get the public comments, and then we can take up in the meeting if there's something that was not covered. Anything? Okay, so
Well, I guess you haven't opened it.
no,
I'll stop.
was there anyone from council that had anything for the study session or anything? Okay, hearing that, open up the public comment to see if there's anyone from the public that wanted to say anything. Susie, there's someone in the hallway.
You can.
You just sit right here. Oh, hello. I just wanted to bring up my water bill because I got a notice for past due and I keep good records and I looked and I wasn't. And I called and they said, oh, just forget about it. You don't know anything. And so they checked me off as not owing anything. And I looked back in my records and I found the amount. And I was like a couple days late, but I paid the late fee. And I'm usually not late, I'm sorry. But my point is, like all these people that might have had like a late bill, the record wasn't updated before they mailed it. So like unless you called and found out you didn't know it, some people might just pay. But I thought I should bring it up because the record should have been updated before they billed people. And I thought it's a waste of postage. And what if somebody doesn't question it because they threatened to put it on your taxes? And I'm like, no, I pay my water bills. I was late. So I just was concerned about, because I know I just was concerned.
That was our special assessment letter that went out, and I had assumed that the person that was supposed to be doing it had taken them off and that, but before they go to taxes, we do check it again. Before I take it off the account, we do check it to make sure that the people that have paid the special assessment is on the list. So we will double check that again before.
I just thought like how many people it would affect that they mailed those bills to. Because it was a waste of postage and I thought, how many people like,
There were a lot of them still on there.
okay. Well, it's just my point. I did not.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Is that related to this billing or was that a different billing?
No, that's a different, that's the special assessments that we brought to you in January.
Gotcha. So this one hasn't been done yet.
No.
Was there anything else that you wanted to bring up?
Is it the appropriate time to talk about quick fix?
Do that or should do it in the meeting?
Pardon me?
I wonder if we should do that or if we should do it in the meeting or.
I don't
Go
know.
ahead.
I'm not familiar, but I looked it up and I saw some agendas, so I just thought I would like speak about that. Should I wait?
Is it something, it was on the agenda for the meeting? The meeting,
Kind of. Go ahead, Lauren.
excuse
Kind
me.
of.
If it's on the meeting, it's on the agenda for the meeting that we're
Yeah,
gonna
I
have.
thought
Yeah.
There's nothing specific related to C-click fix on the study session agenda on the regular meeting. It would just be, it's what's included in the consent agenda.
Okay, so if you can wait until we go to it, because we need to go into our meeting, and then it'll be a public comment at the very beginning of the next meeting, just so we stay on time, if you don't mind doing that. Okay,
Great.
thank you, I appreciate it. So I will ask for a motion to adjourn, so we can adjourn as because we have to switch to Zoom meetings, right?
Yes, we do
Okay.
need to switch things.
All right, so I'm gonna ask for a motion to adjournment. Think we're adjourned.